All right, everyone, happy Tuesday and welcome back to COM 426 Modern Web Programming. This is lecture 12. So I'm going to give everyone a chance to settle down so we can get started with some announcements. All right, so all right, should be good. Thank you. So again, this is hope you all are having a good week. So we started off last week with A03 being released. So it is due tomorrow on Wednesday at 11:59, same time. Seeing great progress. I've been watching on GitHub to kind of see how people are going along. It's looking great. So a lot of people are made it through Wordle, are working on connections. So amazing work there. I will note as well that because I've been talking to some students. This time of year, as always, there's a lot going on when it comes to, for example, maybe interviewing, other exams, and other classes. So I just want to remind everyone about our kind of late drop policy, right? So we have a late period. It's 2 days. However, we give throughout the course 3 free late drops, which means that for 3 of the readings and assignments together, you can drop. You can drop 3 of their late penalties. You can submit 2 days late, and there's no impact at all on the grade. So if this is something, if you're there's a lot going on right now, and you're like, you know what, I think it might be a good idea. Let me use that. You're free to do so. We give 3 of them, so no worries there at all. And also just to maybe help you out with some math, because I know some people are asking like, okay, well, should I use it? How many assignments are coming up? So there are 6 kind of more total things that you would be able to drop. There's 2 readings and 4 assignments remaining. At least that's my tentative plan right now in terms of the assignments. So that's just for your own math to think about. And I'll also note here that we'll always drop the late penalties on assignments first. So out of 3 items, let's say you submitted 2 readings and 2 assignments late, we drop 2 late penalties on the assignment and then 1 on the reading. The reason is because assignments are weighted more, and so there's a greater impact. That late penalty has a greater impact on assignments. So we prioritize assignments when we calculate the final drops over readings to help you all out. All right, are there any questions with the announcements? Terrific. All right, and again, remember here we have office hours tomorrow as well for most of the day. So if you have any questions about the assignment, you're free to go there as well, and the teams would be happy to help you. 2 other announcements. So this is from the CS department. There is a career panel happening tomorrow at 6:30 in SN14. A lot of different company representatives from, for example, Genesis, SAS, Vanguard, Pendo, Fidelity will all be there. So highly recommend. I think you may have to. I don't know if you have to sign up. If you have to sign up, there's a QR code here that you can scan to register. It's co-hosted by a few organizations here. I highly recommend attending these things. The career team here does a lot of good work in creating these different events. So I highly recommend this if you're interested. Again, SN14 at 6:30. And then also another, and I believe the final note here that we'll have for Hack and See. So I believe registration, if I remember correctly, and if someone from Hack and See wants to correct me if I'm wrong, I believe October 3rd is the final date to sign up. So please do so if you haven't already. You can sign up by scanning the QR code. Highly recommend Hack and See every year. It is a great opportunity to maybe work on some projects. There's always usually free food and different things and good chance to meet people. And overall, usually a fun weekend. So highly recommend checking it out. And I suppose if you need this as well, there's CLE credit this time too. All right, so with that out of the way, and also I have to figure out, I'm going to ask the Hack and See team this afterwards, how they got animated like things in their image, because I swear this is a JPEG file and not a. So I'm not sure how that works, but again, there's a lot of great work that goes into this hackathon, so highly recommended. All right, so to kind of build up here from last lecture, I know that it's been a while, right? Last time we met was on Thursday, so just to recap where we were beginning to talk about web app architectures. In particular, we were discussing kind of the differences between 2 types of architectures: the multi-page application, or MPA, and a single-page application, SPA. So just to kind of recap. The main differences here, and we'll go through the diagram again, but an MPA, the idea is that every time you load a new page on your website, you end up Sorry, I want to make sure this mic's actually even on. I feel like so whenever you load a new web page, you get a new HTML file from the server. Right? So every single time we change our page, we are making a request to a server, and the server responds with some HTML. That is a MPA. And then the SPA approach, a single page application, adds this thing called a router. And what the router does is it hijacks the traditional browser processes of loading new pages. And instead of making a new network request to the server to get an HTML page back, we're simply going to render a new React component on the screen that will correspond with the page that we're trying to load. The main benefit of this is that we remove that network request that we have to make, which is usually a very slow operation. So changing pages is really, really fast from the user's perspective. Right? So let's review by kind of going through the diagrams again, because I think that helps to kind of conceptualize where we are. And we're going to be building on this diagram as we go through the lecture today and introduce some new concepts. So our base setup looks something like this, right? We have the development server, which has our HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, just like before. And then we have our client side here, which is the user who's trying to load our website. So we have a browser and we have a server. And whenever we load a page, for example, I'm going to load the home page, we make a request to the server, and the server is going to respond with the corresponding HTML file. So in this case, we are loading the home page, and so we're going to get back index.html, and that is what the client will receive. Then, once that file appears here in the browser, we will first start rendering the page by filling in the DOM with what the HTML file specifies. Right, so remember, for React projects, we talked about this quite a bit in the different examples we had and last time, and even if you open A03, you'd see this as well, is that the HTML file that we get back with a React project is essentially empty. Right, there's one div, it's kind of this container, and then React is responsible for filling in that empty container with the UI that is necessary. Right, so the first thing that appears here in this DOM is maybe just one div, or there's really nothing that's rendered because we essentially have a blank page. Right? And then, of course, nothing appears on the screen at this point. We then make a request for the CSS and JavaScript. Right? So remember, the links to the CSS and JavaScript file are part of the head section. It's metadata in the HTML. And so we're going to make a request for those two types of files. And so the server will then respond with it. We get CSS and JavaScript back. And at this point, we have everything that we need downloaded here on the client. And we can start running the HTML that we downloaded. Any questions here so far? All right, perfect. And so now this is where we kind of get right into the differences between an MPA and an SPA. So in our traditional MPA, or multi-page application approach, right? And in fact, both of these, once you get the HTML, or once you get the JavaScript file, we end up running our React instance in our browser. So all of the React code, all of our functionality for our site is in these JavaScript files. And so we start running these JavaScript files in the browser. This will set up all of the React functionality that we need for our application to work. And at this point, and also a little note here, remember in an MPA, right, we have separate HTML files for each of our different pages. In this case, homepage and about are separate HTML files. And then React will render and update the DOM. Right? So the idea here is that all of our UI, right, these are all React components. All of our React functionality is inside of this JavaScript bundle. And so after we get the JavaScript downloaded, we can then go ahead and render that page to the user. We run the JavaScript, and that makes things appear on our page. OK? Questions so far? All right. And so at this point, it appears that our first page has loaded successfully. Right? So this is just loading the home page. And so now, remember, the main difference here with an SPA and an MPA is kind of how we manage loading subsequent pages. Right? So at this point, let's say that we wanted, this is still our MPA multi-page application example. You can tell because we have two separate HTML files for our different pages, that maybe now at this point, the user wants to change to the About page on our site. So what's going to happen here? Well, we're going to make a request for the About page because, again, in the MPA example, when we change pages, we make a request to the server. Right? That's the key distinction. In an MPA, we make a request to the server on every page change. With an SPA, we don't. Right? So in this case, we make a request. We get back the HTML page for the or the HTML file for the about page. So about.html is what we receive from the server at this point. Remember, at this point then, what happens? Everything in our entire browser setup is erased. We're treating as if we're loading a brand new page. So all the JavaScript we downloaded is deleted. The CSS is deleted. The DOM is cleared. Right? We have a blank white page now on our screen at this point. And now that we have our new, brand new HTML file, we are going to restart this loading process all over again. So we will render a blank div, download CSS and JavaScript, set up our React functionality, and then at this point, we will end up rendering our about page. Right, so you can see at this point, we now have an about page appearing. Questions so far with this? Yeah.
But in React,
yeah,
our pages will apparently have JavaScript attached to them. How does our client know? Okay, this is actually the important data. This is the step we need.
Yes. Good question. So, and I think this is maybe a piece of also the confusion last time when it came to this a little bit, is so when we load the about page has a link, a script tag to a TypeScript file, and that TypeScript file then chooses the React component to render. So for example, and actually I have an example open for this, so we can kind of jump to it. Let me, my mouse is, there it is. Okay. So this is kind of the example that we have that's just a regular React page. And you'll notice that, so we have two separate files here. So we have index.html and about.html, right? And then in our about.html, we have this link to this about main file. And the about main file has this code to render the about page. So what's happening is that every page has it's running its own TypeScript file, which chooses what component to render. Yep. Any other questions? Good question. All right. So go back here. Perfect. And so again, another thing to note here, right, is when we use this MPA approach, we are rerunning our JavaScript and we're setting up React every single time that we load our page. So all this is very slow, right? Making another request to the server, downloading all the JavaScript, rerunning the JavaScript, setting React up again. All of this takes a lot of time, which ultimately the user in a larger app can see. And they might have a flash of a white page. The loading might take longer, et cetera. So this is something that is noticeable to the user. All right. Now, we talked about this. We mentioned the fact that this is a user UI and UX problem, user experience problem for the user. So to kind of fix this, we introduced this model of thinking about how our page loads with a SPA, or single page application. A way to think of this again with the multi-page single page, you can kind of think of this as multiple HTML files, right, for every page. Single page is there's only one HTML file that we load all the time. What this means is here, you can see that on our website, we have two different pages. We have an about page and we have a home page. But in the SPA model, we have only one HTML ultimately on our server. And when we load a page, we fetch this particular file. So in this case, I'm loading my home page. I fetch index.html. And the same type of setup here happens where we have an empty HTML file. So the DOM is kind of empty. We just have one empty div. We fetch the CSS and the JavaScript. But the main difference here now is that in addition to setting up React on our first setup, we also include this piece called a router. And so all an SPA is our traditional approach, but with a router instead of having nothing. And so we load our first page, for example, our home page, because React renders that particular component. And then if we want to change our page, for example, navigate to the about page, Well, instead of making a request to this server again, which is what we did in the MPA approach, in the SPA approach, the router is going to intercept that request. So we click on, let's say, a link to the About page, and that instructs the router to simply tell React to change the active page that is appearing on the site at the current point in time. All right, so the idea here is, again, we are never making another request here to this server, so switching pages is really, really fast. We do not have to download new files. We don't have to set up everything again. We're just using what we already have and change our page in place. Questions here? All right. And then another thing here is that the router will then change the active URL in the browser just to show that the page has actually changed. So that's kind of the last step here. So it looks as though we're on the About page now because the router changes the URL. And again, I already said this before, just a note here, right? With very important thing, this is the main thing to remember with SPAs, we do not make another request to the server for new pages. All right. And so when we add a router, again, this is called a single page application. And when we are building applications, we can choose frameworks to help build our applications with. We had this kind of thought process last time. I think the analogy of a toolbox and individual tools, right? So libraries like React. React is mainly for managing state and building UI interfaces, right? That's the entire point of React. It's one tool. The router is another tool. And so we are combining these tools together to make our websites work. And so when we use a framework is kind of like a toolbox that includes everything in one package. So it's really easy to use everything. And all of our tools are nicely integrated and work well together. So when we build applications and we want to, for example, with an SPA, where we need a router, we need some UI library, we're able to just use one framework and all those pieces are included. Also, again, we did a show of hands on Thursday of who was in Chris Jordan's Comp 590 or 423. And in that class, Angular is an example of such a framework. So in Angular had a router. Angular had other UI kind of they also had this idea of UI components and things like that. And so Angular, if you worked on that or if you were in that class, you were working with a standard SPA, single page app, and all the things that we talked about here. And you can even try and download maybe your old project in that class and see how the router and instead of React and Angular, how everything works together. Right? Yes, sorry. Good question. So most of the time, yes. And this is where we're actually going into today, is to kind of even further refine the SPA model. Because yes, the SPA model is very good for user experience. And so most of these larger, very dynamic apps like Google, where, if you're using Google, you're changing pages a lot, like, very often. And so Google doesn't want a very choppy experience. So an SPA would be the perfect thing to use. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It could be. It could be. That could be an example. I'm not too sure how that particular website works. I think, though, blogs, for example, a lot of those type of pages might be MPAs. And the reason is because like every single page is a piece of content. And so if it's like very static and you're just loading like written content, then a lot of those are MPAs. Yeah. Great questions. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Screens can be search content. Those are accessible from.
Yes. Yes.
SPA, do you only ever access the whole page from something like search?
Yes. So the search engine, especially if kind of uses the traditional search engine like scraping model, the search engines will often, only see the one page because there's only one HTML file that's ever downloaded from the server. And so you will pretty much the only page that will get indexed will be that first page. Yep. And we're going to, again, today we'll be expanding on that a little bit to try and solve both problems at once. So we're getting into it. So great questions so far. Any other questions on kind of the review from last time. All right. So one other key piece of terminology that I want to mention here, and I apologize, these lectures, so the lecture in this section, there's a lot of acronyms, so I apologize about it. It's just the way, even if you look online in the web development world, they use a lot of 3-letter acronyms. Here's another one. So this is CSR, or client-side rendering. The idea is basically everything that we've been doing up until this point with the MPA approach or the SPA approach, right? In both approaches, we start off with essentially an empty HTML file, and then React, which is running in the browser, is responsible for rendering that particular page and filling in the rest of the page to actually have content, right? So this particular approach where our page is being rendered on by the browser, by React running in the browser, that is known as client-side rendering. So our React components are being rendered and turned into HTML on the client side here. That is client-side rendering, abbreviated as CSR. Any questions with that? All right. So again, we kind of ended with this, and there's a lot of good questions mentioning this as well, regarding the trade-offs between the MPA approach and the SPA approach. A lot of the lecture on Thursday was talking about how SPAs are very good, and the framing and the way that I was talking made it seem as the clear, obvious choice for these websites, right? Why use an MPA? SPA is better in these metrics. Well, the only caveat to that, and this is what we kind of closed with on Thursday, is this idea of, again, search engine optimization, right? SEO. It's the idea of how well will our website be able to be indexed and searched by these search engine crawlers that are out there trying to determine the content of your page for its PageRank algorithm, right? And so we talked about the fact that SPAs are better in user experience and interactivity and speed because of changing pages is really fluid, except the problem with SEO is that if you have only one HTML page, the search engines will only see that one page because it downloads it and it tries to look at it. And because the search engine crawlers do not run JavaScript, it can't get anywhere after that. You just have your one page and that's it. Right? Any questions with kind of this piece from last time? Perfect. And so what we're going to be introducing to kind of solve this problem in the framework that we're going to be using in this class is called Next.js. Next.js is one of the largest, if not I believe it still is, the most prevalent React full web framework that is used. You can see that on GitHub, it's one of the largest GitHub repositories by stars. It is over 130,000 stars. It's managed by a company called Vercel, coincidentally, the same company that we use to host your websites currently. Vercel also manages Next.js. And Next.js is a full framework. So it is like what we were talking about. It's like a full toolkit, a full toolbox. It has a lot of things included. In particular, React is included for building our UI. Tailwind is included for making styling those components easier. TypeScript is included for proper static typing and all the benefits that TypeScript brings over JavaScript. And Next.js also has its own router that makes switching between pages very easy. So from that standpoint, because Next.js has its own router, it's more similar to the SPA model based on what we've only talked about so far, right? Compared to the two, because it has a router, it falls more into the SPA camp than the MPA camp. Except ultimately, what Next.js's architecture is it's a little bit of a hybrid of both approaches. It brings a unique, kind of this unique technique that, well, I guess I shouldn't say unique because other frameworks use it too, but it brings a very useful technique that helps to bridge this gap and make, essentially, have the best of both worlds, where you have a really good user experience from the SPA, but you also have very good SEO from kind of the MPA world. All right. And so the key thing here with Next.js, and that we're going to be interacting, which makes this possible to have better SEO, is the fact that when you build a Next.js project and you deploy the project, there is also code generated from Next.js that runs on the server. So I'm going to show this here in a diagram. What this means is you can see, imagine that we're developing a Next.js project. and we build the project ready to deploy it somewhere. Kind of just like how we have been doing with Vercel all this time. And our TypeScript's converted to JavaScript. We generate a CSS file from Tailwind. All that same stuff happens. So you can see we build our project, and what's ultimately given back is this what's like this .next folder. That's what ultimately is the output of our build step. It includes all of the things that you would expect. So it includes HTML. It includes a whole bunch of JavaScript, and it includes some CSS as well. So kind of the same setup that we've had. Next.js generates that too. But the key note here that's very important is that when we deploy our application to the server, there is actually code running that Next.js generated over here in the actual server. So this is a bit of a difference because in our previous models, so if I kind of jump backwards a little bit to our models like this, we just had files essentially sitting on the server as resources that we requested. There wasn't like actually any program running on this side. The files just existed there, and we just fetched them when necessary. Okay? Now, with the Next.js approach, we have actual functionality, actual code running on the server side. Okay? This is all possible, and this is a bit of a connection back to our lecture on Node. This is all possible because remember, the entire idea of Node was to be able to run JavaScript outside of the browser. And so this server, remember, servers are just computers, right? So this server is running your code using Node. So it's able to run JavaScript outside of the browser environment. As you can imagine, we have a program here that's running constantly on the server that Next.js creates. Any questions so far? We're going to get to why this, like how this is actually used next. Right? So again, we have functionality here on the server that's running. So now, what happens when we try and load a page using Next.js? So imagine that I'm trying to load the home page in the same type of way that I have in my other two approaches, which means I make a request to my server for the home page. Right? Now there's code running here. And so our server functionality is going to see that request, and it's going to do something. What actually happens, though, here is the key distinction, which is that when we get this request for the home page, the Next.js server is going to try and generate the full HTML file for the page that we request. So using React, we have our React components. Because we have code running here, it's going to try and render our React component over here on the server side and output an HTML file that actually looks like the page. The key difference here is that in our previous approach with MPA and SPAs, right, in our base model, we just got back a blank HTML file that didn't have anything in it. Right? It was the job of the React running here in the browser to actually render our component. Right? So the difference here is that instead of the browser doing it, the server is going to do it when we request the page. So the final HTML file we get actually looks exactly like the page that we are trying to load. It's not an empty shell. All right? And so then what that means then is that when we get this HTML file back on the client side and we load it into the DOM for the first time, the entire page will appear, because that HTML has already been written for you. So immediately the browser will see the text, any of the elements that are necessary on that page, it will all appear. And so the home page, you can see here, that text will appear on my screen immediately. All right. This approach, in comparison to this client-side rendering approach that we saw, this approach where the server uses React to render the component and then gives back the HTML page, this is what's known as server-side rendering, abbreviated as SSR. Okay? This particular technique in itself is the main way that React is going to overcome this SEO shortcoming of an SPA. We're going to talk about, and we're going to round that out in a moment. Right? And so what I would like you to do, there's been a good amount of discussion here so far. And so we're going to take a moment. You can talk to the people around you, digest maybe also what's going on. And in addition to that, there's a grade scope question. And I'd like you to think about what's happened so far. We have this HTML page. We have something appearing on our screen. The question is our page interactive at this point? So for example, if I have buttons on the page, can I click on them? Will things happen? That is the question that I have. So we'll spend maybe 3 minutes. Let's go 5 minutes to discuss this, and then we'll come back together and talk about it. All right, everyone, make sure again to complete the grade scope submission for this today. You can write your thoughts down. Show of hands, two things. Yes, the page is interactive. Okay, and then no, show of hands. Nice. So you are all for the most part correct. It is not interactive. Why is our page here not interactive? Well, remember that in order for pages to do things in our browser, in order for functionality to happen, we still need JavaScript, right? JavaScript is the language that specifies this behavior. And React, in terms of, even though React components, they may have event handlers, or maybe there are some different things that are set up, states, whatever, all of that that's all specified in JavaScript. And so even though we have a HTML file here, this is just like a static HTML file all the way back from like what you did in A01, your personal portfolio. It has the content, but there's nothing else, no functionality attached to it at this point, right? So this is called sometimes inert, static, all different synonyms for the same thing. So buttons will not work on our page. States will not hold data. There won't be anything going on here, no re-rendering. And so we still need the JavaScript code from our server in order for this page to become interactive. So what happens is that just like before, when we fetch our HTML page, once we fetch it, we then make another request for the CSS and JavaScript files associated with my HTML page. So you can see at this point, from our HTML, we're going to fetch the CSS and the JavaScript necessary for our page to become interactive. And we are then going to run all that JavaScript. And what's left on the server, or sorry, on the client here, is our Next.js functionality. So that includes React, that includes the router. Everything is now downloaded and it's running in the browser. Okay? So the key thing here to note is that even though really the only thing that changes in our SSR approach is this initial page, the initial HTML we get from the server, that is complete. It's no longer blank. Everything else after that point is the exact same as the SPA approach, because we download everything we need. We download React. We have a router here. So future page changes will happen locally. We don't have to make a request for them. And so this is giving us all of the benefits of an SPA, because we can change pages really quickly. The only thing that changes is that the HTML we get is a fully fleshed out HTML page. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Good question. So I think that is always, so that's a risk always, regardless of whether we're using Next.js, SPA, MPA, it's always a risk, because we're always from the server getting some JavaScript back. That JavaScript may not be, hopefully the developer makes sure that this JavaScript is going to work with the browsers that are most common. So this is always a problem because in the end, we're still getting the same JavaScript files back. It's just the only thing that's changed here is we get a different HTML file. So that is a good point. It is a problem that may happen, but that's more of up to the developer. Yep. And so now another thing to note here, which you might think is a little bit strange, is like, okay, in our original version with our SPA and our MPA, where we created our React components on the client side, well, everything that was necessary to kind of hook those components up, like event handlers, that's all managed by React. And so in this case, we have HTML that we got from the server, from this HTML file, and the React functionality that we load in here is being loaded in separately, right? Our first page is not being rendered by React. And so we need to then reconcile the fact that, okay, we have this static HTML page we got from the server. React here is telling me that this page has functionality, right? Because we said originally, right, that HTML does not have functionality. We need to somehow add the functionality in to the HTML that already exists. And so this process here, where Next.js will look at the HTML that was generated, and it will fill in, it'll connect that HTML to any event handlers, any functionality that we specified after the fact. This process is known as hydration. You may have heard this term before. All this is saying we have functionality we specified in our app. We need to now make the page that we got interactive. So let's add in the functionality where we need to. So for example, if a button on my page had an event handler, right? Back here, when I loaded the HTML for the first time, there was a button on my page. It didn't have any event handler attached to it. It was just completely, nothing worked. And so once we download the JavaScript, we then need to go back and add that functionality to the button that was there. Okay? The analogy, and I think the terminology hydration, you can kind of think of this like a shriveled plant, right? So, you have some plant that's kind of shriveled up. It's in a pot. It looks like the plant that's there. The plant exists, but then when you add water to it after the fact, right, it springs back to life. That's kind of the same idea, where we have a website. It's like the plant's HTML. Then we add in we add in all the stuff necessary to make the page actually become alive and become interactive. Questions here? All right, perfect. Sorry, the light is blinding me today. Perfect. And so again, key note here is that after this point, after we get this HTML file, after we perform hydration, we will have our app running just like it was before, and we can continue now to treat it as an SPA because we have everything we need. We have a page that's interactive, we have React running, we have a router running. And so now if I want to load, for example, the About page, I can simply, I don't have an animation for it, so I'll draw it. If we want to load the About page here from my browser, our browser will make a request, right, to the router, and the router will tell React to swap out the page with my new About page. So I never have to go back to the server after this point. It's the same idea as an SPA. So again, when we have this SSR approach, the only thing that's different between this and a regular SPA is the fact that the HTML we get from the server actually looks like the website, and that it's not blank. That's the only difference practically in these approaches. Any questions here? All right. And so now I want to maybe illustrate this a bit better, and we're actually going to see an example in the browser too. Why is SSR better for SEO? I'm going to compare our traditional SPA approach, and we're going to compare our Next.js approach, which uses SSR, from the perspective of a search engine crawler. Remember, search engine crawlers cannot run JavaScript. So we're going to pretend in this case, in both of our examples, we're going to make a request for a page. We can't run JavaScript, and go. Let's see what happens. So let's say that we're trying to load the About page here. We use this term index, right? Indexing is just this idea of let's read this page, figure out what this page is about, and then rank it in some way so that later on, if someone searches something in Google, we can determine if that page is relevant. So I apologize that the term index is a bit overloaded between index.html and just indexing. This is indexing in the terms of the search engine. Okay? So in both cases, we load the About page. We make a request to our server on the top for an About page. On the bottom, we make a request for the About page. And in this case, and you can see at the top, we return a blank HTML page that has nothing in it. But in the SSR approach, the server functionality for Next.js generates that HTML. And so here, the difference is that between the HTML with our SSR approach and our regular HTML, one is blank and one actually looks like my page. The SSR one actually says About page, and the top one is still blank. The next step here is to load the JavaScript from the server. And so we may load it here. And then notice that since crawlers cannot run JavaScript, it stops here. And at this point is when it's going to read the website. Because JavaScript cannot run, there's nothing more for the crawler to do. And so that's why you can see between both of these versions, the SSR approach, because it pre-generated our page for us, we actually have something to read here as a search engine. In our top approach, though, our HTML page is blank. And so there is nothing to read. And therefore, there's really nothing for the search engine crawler to go off of. Right? And so, and I think I already said all of this. Key thing to note is, yes, in our case, our Next.js page here is not interactive, but that doesn't matter because the search engine is just reading the page to determine what's on it. It's not like clicking buttons or anything anyway. So that is not really an issue here. And so the key thing here is that when you use SSR in a framework like Next.js, you get all the benefits of an SPA. You have the router, so loading pages is really, really fast, very performant. And also, you have very good SEO because the HTML that's generated is exactly what the page should look like. And so the search engine is able to read the entire content of the page, index it properly. And so if somebody searched something that matched what's on my page on Google, they would see the page here. And so I have both examples to kind of show you from the perspective of a search engine between our regular CSR approach and our Next.js approach. I found out how to disable JavaScript in Chrome. And so if you're on Chrome, today we'll be doing it in Chrome because I know that if we try in Safari, this is going to break. So here is my page with client-side rendering. And actually, I apologize, there's no actual written out link here. So if you go to the slides, find the slide, and then click on it, it should take you there. I forgot to write out the actual go.unc link. But we have both of these in Stack Blitz. And so this is our traditional non-SSR approach. We have these separate pages, and we load these in. And so when we are on our home page here, right, if I refresh, we see our page, it's fine. But if I disable JavaScript, so if you go to, if you open your developer tools in Chrome, and you press on the settings button here on the right-hand side, right? So if you press on that settings button, and then scroll down to where it says debugger, you will see that there's a check mark for disable JavaScript. And so I will disable JavaScript now. And then I'm going to refresh my page. And you'll see that when I refresh my page here, I have a completely blank HTML page that comes back, right? So this, if the search engine was loading my page, this is what it would see, right? There's nothing on it at all. And so now this page here uses Next.js. And so I'm not going to show the code just yet. We'll do that in a moment. But just this is our page using SSR. I'm going to do the same thing where I'm going to disable JavaScript. And then I'm going to refresh my page. And you will see that what we get back from the server is the content of our page. Right? It is the full HTML is generated. There's no CSS, right? Because we're just loading HTML here, which is why there's no color, right? We load HTML first, then we fetch. And so because there is nothing to run, there's no JavaScript, we just get our HTML back because we're using server-side rendering. And so this is great now because if I'm a search engine, right, and my job is trying to figure out what does this page say, well, I can read it right there, and I can run whatever natural language processing algorithms or whatever I need to run on this because there's actual content here. Right? So when you are developing a site, maybe you're running a company, you're working at a company, you're developing a site, and people visiting your site is important to you in some metric, whether it's because you're trying to make money or you want people to see your site. Well, you can now see in very clear terms that, whoops, I didn't mean to close that. So hopefully I think the point was clear, right? You have both of these options, and so you want to end up choosing, and most of people in industry will choose the stack and the technologies that enable better SEO. Any questions here so far? Great. So I'm going to now jump into, and I think I have, let's see. Yes. because we actually have a bit of time left, I'm going to talk about how we actually create a Next.js app. And we're going to do a very brief kind of interaction with this tool, so you can learn a little bit about how this all works. And then we'll dive even more into it on Thursday, now that we kind of understand the concepts behind it. So what I'm going to do is, because StackBlitz, especially with Next.js, and this is where, unfortunately, StackBlitz is great, but Next.js is usually a bit more computationally. There's usually there's a lot more things going on. There's a lot of things that has to be installed. StackBlitz is a bit more buggy with Next.js. And so instead, I'm going to just show you how to do this on your computer. And that way, even when you're later in the course, you want to make a website from scratch, you'll see the steps that are required to set up a Next.js project. Right? There's a really nice helper function called create next app that you can just run in your terminal using Node, and it will create a Next.js app for you. You can kind of think of this like a helper script. And so there are installation instructions. So I recommend going to this URL, and there is some detail here. You can see here that you only need these two things. One is you need Node.js installed. I believe, and hopefully I'm not wrong on this, I believe that through doing the things in this class that you've had to do, and just because I think a lot of these operating systems these days include this, you should have Node installed. If you don't, you can work with somebody near you to install it. Of course, you can also install it yourself just by clicking here on this Node.js 18.18, and then there's this Get Node.js button that you can download. Again, though, it should be there, so we'll see what happens. But when you have Node installed, all you have to run is this npx create next app, and then the at latest is the version of Next.js you want to use. So we want to use the latest version. You run that, and it will generate a Next.js project for you in your directory. So I'm going to show this here. I'll keep this on one side, and we'll open up the terminal. Let me move the terminal to a page that's actually visible here. There we go. Make this really big. So I'm in a developer folder, and I'm going to create a new Next.js app. So the setup here is we'll just run npx create next app at latest. And we'll now have some setup questions. What is your project named? I will just call this comp426 live example. You can name this anything that you like, as long as it's not the name of a folder that already exists. And now we have questions about what tools do we want to include in our Next.js configuration. First question here, do we want to use TypeScript? Yes, we do. So we'll just press enter for yes. And then we haven't talked about linters yet. Linters are a set of tools that essentially allows us to auto-format our code whenever we press save. So we'll just stick with the slint here. This is the default. Do we want to use Tailwind? Of course. Tailwind is great, so we'll say yes. Do you want your code inside a source directory? Default is no, so we'll press no. The only thing here that's very important for this class is this question. Would you like to use app router? And it says recommended, and there's a yes and no option. Make sure to select no. So there are two different routing approaches that Next.js has. The pages router is the one that we're going to be using. It's far more intuitive, and it's using technology. It's using SSR and everything that we already know. The app router is a much more cutting edge, extremely complicated way of rendering that tries to make even more optimizations, but it's more optimizations than we need. And ultimately, the setup is too complicated for this class. So we're going to stick with no here. So if you have this option, make sure that no is selected. By default, it will ask you to say yes, but the answer here that you should choose is no. If you did say yes by accident, you can always change it once you created the project, but this is a little bit helpful here. TurboPack doesn't really matter. I'll say no, but this is just so TurboPack is a build tool. So like, with Vite, we build using Vite. It generates all of our server files. TurboPack is just another faster version of that. So depends, it doesn't really matter. And so we'll just now press enter and finish up our setup. And you'll see, notice what happens. We're installing no dependencies. So we're installing React we're installing Next, we're installing TypeScript, we're installing Tailwind, all the stuff that we need is being installed, right? So remember, frameworks are like a toolbox. We're getting everything in one here, and it's installed for us by default. And so we'll run through this, and you can try. If you didn't get an error running npx, then you have Node installed, and so this should work on your computer. And then once it's done, you'll see that it says success, created this particular, created the project here, and now we can open it. I will also note that the next setup here will also create a Git repository for you, so you can push your changes to GitHub if you wish. And so I am going to go into this particular folder here. Whoops, I have a lot of, there we go. So I've CD'd into my new project here, and we can open this in VS Code. So I will just run code dot, which should, if you have everything configured right, VS Code will open. But you can also just go into VS Code and just open this folder too. It should all be the same. There we go. And I am going to, and I know for the haters of light mode, I apologize. I'm going to switch to light mode because this is, I think, way too hard to see in the back. So let me go ahead and do that. Theme, color theme, light modern. There we go. Nice and bright. I know it's polarizing, but we have a good, we have stuff here. So the main thing that I want to note is when we go into, when we open our project, you see this particular setup here. We have 3 folders that are created by default. We have public, we have pages, and then we have styles. The way that Next.js works is all of our pages of our app go in the pages folder. And if I open the pages folder, you will see that we have this particular file here called index.tsx. This is going to be the home page of our website. Okay? So I can click on this, and you'll see there's a lot of stuff in here, but you should recognize the fact that this is a React component. And so every single page is defined as a React component in our project. And so what I'm going to do here to simplify this all is first there's this API folder I'm going to delete. We don't need it. And I'm also going to erase everything in here and just create a very, very simple React component that makes this a little bit easier to read. So I will delete everything. And in index.tsx, I'll just write here export default function and then home. And I will just return a paragraph that says hello world. Very simple. So the idea with Next.js is that the page or the specific URL that's used to open your page is the same file directory that you're ultimately going to have in your pages folder. What I mean by that is that everything inside of this pages folder, where the page is located in this folder, is the exact same as the route that the page is associated with. For example, I'm going to start up this project here. To start it, you will run the exact same command as you have always done. It's npm run dev. And you'll see that it's going to run this next dev function. We create a project that I can open on this particular URL, localhost 3000. And you'll see that my page says hello world. Okay? So index.tsx is associated with index.html. It's my home page. If I want to create an about page on my site, I will simply create a new file called about.tsx. That'll be the component associated with the about page. And I'm going to paste a new component in here called about. And we'll say about page. So now if I go back to my page here, right, this says hello world. If I navigate to the about URL, it should show me my about page, which is really, really nice. So where my where my component is located is directly analogous to the route that you can access it as. Here's another example. So say that I want to have a route that is like my domain localhost.com or localhost 3000 slash courses slash com426. That is the route that I want my page to load at. Well, how will we do that? Here in this pages folder, again, our file directory is matching or should match the exact same structure as the route. So in pages, we would create a new folder called courses. And then inside of the folder, I will create a page called comp426.tsx, like so. And let me copy my component over and call this, there we go, comp426 page. Okay. So now what we're saying is that when we navigate to courses slash 426, it is going to show this particular component on the page. So if I go back and I write here courses comp426, it will show my comp426 page. So this is a very nice system that Next.js has. It is also used by some other frameworks as well. It's called file-based routing, I believe. So the idea is that the routing, like how we change pages and where pages are defined, is the file directory of that is what will determine what is the path in the browser that I would have to use to access that page. So in this case, again, you can just look, you can imagine pages is like your first slash. And then in order to load comp426, I have to do slash courses slash comp426 to access that particular page. Are there any questions so far? Yeah. Yeah. Good question. So you're saying like if I want a courses page and a comp426, perfect. Let's actually show this here, and then actually, in addition, we'll show linking. So this is a great example. So how this will work in this particular case is we can treat index.tsx kind of as like a blank path in our route. So if I want to have a courses page and a courses slash comp426 page, I can have the structure looking something like this, where I create a new index.tsx file. So what this means is index.tsx will be the page that loads at the courses route, and then the comp426 page will load at the courses comp426 route. So for example, export default function courses page, and then let's return a div this time that has a title. Sorry, I meant to do this correctly here. H1 courses, and then we'll just have a paragraph for comp426 for now. And so if I go back here to my browser and I were to just remove comp426 and go to localhost/courses, I should see my courses page appear here. So you can see that this is a very nice system, because if I'm ever at a certain route and I'm trying to find what component runs that route, I can just go into my file directory and find it very easily. There's not all these separate files that you have to manage to connect a component to a specific route in Next.js. The final thing that I want to kind of emphasize, and actually maybe this is a good connection back to our slides here. If I were to jump to my SPA example, and actually I mentioned this last lecture, so I'm going to jump to this. I mentioned briefly that in the router part, I mentioned here that instead of using an A tag, whenever we use a router, there is usually a provided link component that we use that runs our router functionality. That does exist here in Next.js. So instead of using an A tag to link to my page, I will instead use something called link. And you can see that link is in this package next.link. And so I can write in here, whoops, it needs to be capitalized here. And if you highlight over, it tells you, so href, I believe is is that correct here? Import. There we go. We have all this AI autocompletion, which is wrong. So I don't think, so in here, I guess we could accept this suggestion now. So now that everything's imported, right, in href, I will write in the link to my website. And now when I go here to my page, and I press on go to this is my link. So let me remove my other, there we go. Perfect. And I press on this, it will take me directly to my courses page. And notice how fast that loading was, right? I pressed and it immediately appeared. This is the benefit of using an SPA because you can just immediately switch your pages. If I were to make my page here a different color, so let's say I do class name equals BG, we'll just choose a yellow. And apologies, I'm kind of rushing through this part. This is just getting a, this is not really going to work. Let's make this a div just to show you like a full page. So if I go back here, there we go. We have a yellow page. And then in my home page here, let's make this a blue page. W full, H screen. There we go. If I go back here to my courses route, right, you'll see that switching, see how you don't see pretty much any, you don't see any white kind of a blank page appear at all. Because again, we're just switching using the Next.js, or sorry, using the React functionality built in. And to make this a little bit clearer here, I will add one final link that goes back. So link, there we go, back to courses. So if I go back, right, switching here, you can see it's basically instant. And this is why user experience using SPA's SSR is so good. All right, everyone, that is all that I have for this. Are there any questions before we head out? Great. All right. So we'll see you then on Thursday. Make sure that you keep working on A03. If you have any questions, you can come to office hours. I'd be happy to help you.